Don't get excited. There's not really a W. W. Norton edition of Seminar 14, The Logic of Fantasy. There's only Cormac Gallagher's translation, made available online from his website, Lacan in Ireland. During COVID times, I spent time with a few online friends reading Seminars 9 and 14. As a quick cut-and-paste mechanic, my job was to ferry graphics across from the French transcripts, which were relatively rich with illustrations and more complete as texts, to the Gallagher text, whose graphics never surpassed the level of a pencil sketch on a napkin. For the next 5 minutes, I'll summarize the two texts in the left-right columns, Gallagher on the left, to give you an idea of what the reader limited to English has to suffer for not studying French better in high school. Gallagher's team tries its best, but it falls far short of the spiffy French transcript, and in some cases it just gives up altogether. We are missing interventions from André Green and Jacques-Alain Miller. We don't have drawings of the crosscap. Some diagrams are split across 2 pages. The English text is workable, but you can sense that Gallagher, like many Lacanians, might be wishing that topology would just go away. This assessment is ungrateful in light of the fact that, were it not for Gallagher, the non-French speaker would have little or no access to these unpublished seminars. In the land of the blind, the one eye through this keyhole will have to be enough. But the advantage of comparing the Gallagher text to the French transcript reveals a lot, mainly that Lacan was no slouch as a visual thinker. He not only did his best to make sense of figures in the real projective plane, he aimed to show how this real relates to the psychoanalytic real, and how the immersion of the 2D form into 3D Euclidean space amounts to the psyche showing itself off as a matrix of symptoms. Lacan's mathematizations, known as mathemes, his diagrams, such as the famous L and R schemas, and of course the large graph called the graph of desire, and the formulas that mimic math functions on behalf of metaphor and metonymy, depend on the topology of projection discovered by Pappus of Alexandria in 300 AD and rediscovered by Girard Desargues in the 16th century. Projective geometry was discovered after Euclid, but it is logically prior to Euclidean geometry. It is like Oscar Levant saying that he knew Doris Day before she was a virgin. Or more to the point, Lacan asking what was anamorphosis before it was anamorphosis. Before anamorphosis, there were the customs, rituals, observances, and what we call superstitions of pre-modern cultures. In other words, before anamorphosis was anamorphosis, it was the uncanny. In the spirit in which Mladen Dolar has claimed that anamorphosis can be extended to cover every topic in psychoanalysis, this means that we take anamorphosis where we find it, namely in ethnology, in art, in popular culture, in religious practices. But it is in architecture that we find the same contrast between a clinical practice and a practical extended life that we find in psychoanalysis. Therefore, it is as an architectural theorist that I offer up a view of how such an abstract thing as projective geometry is not just helpful, but necessary to understand the psyche that is extended into the world. It may seem fussy to call attention to Lacan's insistence on using Euler circles instead of Venn diagrams, or to give a name to the matrix we find in Session 5 that should be labeled the Cayley-Klein matrix. There is an abundance of brilliant scholarship in Lacan world, but also an element of neglect, as when Zizek continues to refer to 1 grain more, 1 hair less, rather than give us its proper name, sorites, or as when Kojin Karatani fails to tell us the full story of Parallax. These are not big problems, but they open the way for a different kind of scholarship that builds upon these solid gains, but extends into extension in the spirit that Lacan designated by the neologism of extimacy. You get the point. We should be grateful to Gallagher for making it possible to read Seminar 14, and happy that as many of the graphics of the original lecture survived in the French transcript, that Gallagher linked to his website, Lacan in Ireland. 14 is a treasure trove of visual thinking, however. Lacan literally throws down the topology gauntlet. One must understand space and time's relation to the psyche, or just forget about it. The clinician must get out of the house to know what Lacan is talking about. When in session 14, Lacan advises us to take our slide rules to bed with us, he revives an amazing earlier claim, that the origins of language have a basis in sex, but that, even more amazing, sex has its basis in the log-log relation of numbers, where a cut produces an iterative but durable constant, the golden section. Lacan connects the Fibonacci number series not just with the big other and the Auger petit a, but also with the unary trait, which Gallagher refuses to write numerically, as does the French transcript. We shouldn't miss this one, which is a double of itself, a one of one. If the seminar is ever translated officially, it will be interesting to see what happens to this amazing mathematization of the unary trait, which we do not see later until Seminar 17, the other side of psychoanalysis. I like the fact that Freud wrote this enigmatic statement about psyche being extended and not knowing anything about it on the same day Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers appeared on the cover of Life magazine. Although the movie Swing Time appeared 2 years earlier, I think the movie's title makes an important point, that extension is simultaneously spatial and temporal, like tap dancing. Extension is not just something pushed out into space, it involves time, and time not just as a linear sequence, but as repetition, coincidence, simultaneity, and déjà vu overlaps. Without this extension, you wouldn't have the origami fold of the après-coup that is so critical to clinical analysis. But I would go a step further with this. If we move from psyche being extended to psyche being extension itself, we move from Freud to Lacan. We move from a Euclidean puzzle space to a topological basis for finding homeostasis after displacement. Without extension, there can be no place to be lost from, no place that can be out of place. But we can think of extension in lots of ways. We can think of traveling from one point to another. We can think of locales that use position to control and mediate. Lacan's topology strikes fear in the heart of many Lacanians, but there is a challenge. Without topology, we have missed the point of psyche extended. But just as important, we have missed all chance of connecting psychoanalysis to culture, continuing not only Lacan's relentless and vigorous connection of clinic to culture, but Freud's own discontented civilization with its totems and taboos. Psyche is the truth out there, that is the truth of the out there, the truth of truth, but we have to know how to look for it. In the case of Rome, we have to pay attention to the way that Roman walls were drawn on the ground with a plow, how that furrow was imagined to be filled with sacrificial blood, and not just any blood, but the blood of a murdered twin. This ritual space had to be preserved and maintained by periodic purification. But the amazing thing is that in terms of Roman law, this ring, called the pomerium, was the only actual ground of the real city. Everything on either side of it was regarded as mere territory. To understand the ethnology of city foundations, we need words proper to the rituals, but to understand the way this involves the extension of psyche, we need to choose words carefully to protect both the interest of the clinic and the cultural space where psyche doesn't just extend itself, but is itself the extension. Seeing Psyche as extension itself begs us to ask another question. Extended how? The example of Rome's Pomerium shows how the architectural drawing of the plan, known as an ethnography according to Vitruvius, is also what is historically called a cartographic mark. This is not a common term, but it relates to well-known historical examples, such as the injunction of Popilius, which Lacan mentions in Seminar 9, identification, and to the biblical story of Jesus in the case of the woman convicted of adultery. The cartographic mark makes the surface of its medium into a 2D manifold, so encirclement has the magic effect of being an apotrope, paralyzing or halting those who would do you evil. The deeper sense of cartography goes back, however, to the story of Romulus and Remus, and how it takes two kings to rule a kingdom, one living, one dead. This is the theme of the uncanny, the living person with an element of death, and the dead person who does not take death all that seriously, as in the story of Castor and Pollux. The cartographic mark is simultaneously down into something and at the same time specifying that it must be viewed from above in an orthographic way that does away with the idea of parallax and establishes parallel lines of sight, presumably which only the gods can enjoy. Nonetheless, you see this complicated idea in some localized references, such as Bataille's novel The Blue of Noon, and Eratosthenes' no-nonsense proof of the Earth's sphericity. With the idea of the cartographic mark, you get a lot of related ideas. But if you sum them all up, they all obey two rules of projective topology, namely that in two-space, figures will be self-intersecting, such as the Klein bottle, Mobius band, and crosscap, and they will involve non-orientation. We can use these figures in both mathematical ways and in ethnography, where twins are an example of non-orientation, and the practice of teaming a dead twin with a living brother will be to encircle both a territory and a temporal interval. Ethnology and topology merge in some cases with instructive results. With the classic tri-folded passageways of the Thesean labyrinth, said to be the path that the freshly dead soul must trod before finding rest, the only question is direction. If you forget which way you are going, you will be continually lost trying to second-guess yourself. At some points in the meander, you seem to be heading out, at others heading in. You can't rely on Euclid to get you out of this one. You have to rely on a knowledge of how fractal spaces work. Each pathway is actually a double vector, making the 7 layers into 14, a reference to the number 40, perhaps, which is the universal number of quarantine. In our recent experience of sheltering in place, we should at least be aware that the interval between the two deaths involves paralysis while we are still living, or trying to live. When we use topology to connect psychoanalysis to culture, we have to avoid some classic but fatal mistakes. I adore Jerry Fleer's book, but at the end, and as a kind of conclusion, she makes a horrible misrepresentation of Lacan's topological project. The same mistake was made by mystics and fiction writers at the beginning of the 20th century, misrepresenting nearly 100 years of mathematical advances made by the likes of Plücker, Riemann, Gauss, Klein, Mobius, and Lobachevsky. Totally forgotten, totally ignored, all by assuming Euclidean space as a primary basis on top of which a mystical fourth dimension could lead us all to the liminal beyond of past and future. If I could wish for only one thing for you to take away from this presentation, it would be to remember that projective geometry doesn't add a dimension, it subtracts a dimension. Projective forms we see are immersed into 3-space, where we can visibly inspect the cuts and folds, but none actually exist in 2-space. Projective geometry is logically prior to Euclid, although it was discovered after Euclid by a nice fellow named Pappus of Alexandria. Lacan cites the French architect who revived Pappus in the 16th century, Girard Desargues. You should take a look at their amazing theorems. Remember, don't add, subtract. You'll get a surface of time. In Euclidean space, the element of time is unavoidable. The unseen side of things is implicit, and to guarantee solid reality, you have to accept that a future trip around things will be required. Parallax can be a confusing issue, and neither Zizek nor Karatani have defined it correctly, in my view. It is both the involvement of muscles of the eye, motion, and memory rehearsals to move from the 2D retinal image to a 3D conceptual construct. You might say that the fourth dimension of time is inserted between the first two and the third dimension. The fourth dimension of time and muscular movement makes the extension of depth into a cultural matter. We learn how to tell time and how to move in space and obey spatial rules through cultural prescriptions about boundary behavior. When Kant expanded the idea of parallax to include the puzzle of how two observers might handle the differences of their points of view, he was left with the remainder of the ethical demand, that despite the differences of views imposed by our inability to stand in the same place at the same time, we nonetheless expected parallax to resolve a commonly felt depth dimension. Just so, it turns out that each culture fashions depth in its own way, in rules we might group under the heading of a strange word, cathetus. This is not an abstract mental puzzle, but something you can experience directly if you are able to see the spatial depth that emerges out of the 2D pattern of a stereogram. This more or less proves that projective geometry is not a spooky remote fiction, but something imminent, and even over-proximate if you take neural networks into account. Cathetus is simultaneously personal and intimate, and the product of the collective, of culture. And Kant is the first thinker to realize that psyche is not just extended, but extension itself. How else could cultures claim to be grounded in their own synthetic, phantasmic reality? But what if parallax is suddenly dismantled when cathetus gives way, when the blue of noon overwhelms the ethical obligation to see a common world? This is what happens when a cartographic cut obliges us to look with the eyes of an angel, or more likely a devil, to see something emerge from an inside position, a space inside space. We can demonstrate this to ourselves without the danger of having angels or devils do it for us, by staring past a stereogram pattern, allowing our eyes to relax. The two views, left and right, force the neural networks to deal with the small variations in the flat pattern to realize an emergent 3D form within the 2D surface, complete with its own vanishing point and parallax effects. This demonstrates the possibility of a kind of epiphany experience, a space inside a space, entirely based on a 2D topology overlap. We can experience a stereogram directly and see for ourselves what it means to grasp personally and materially what Euclid defined as impossible. The torus is the Rosetta Stone form, a structure that shows psyche not just as extending itself, but being extension in the real of the projective plane. When parallax is impossible and over-proximity unavoidable, the temporality of the act is the only surviving dimension. To say that the big other and the objet petit a slide across each other is not only a helpful visual aid, it's the only way we have of imagining experiments to extend Lacan's paradigms into cultural situations. The slide rule analogy is like an experimental control that keeps terms on the same semantic plane, a plane of the clinic. But for extending psychoanalysis to cultural conditions, we need to take another plane. Lacan's terms, repetition, passage à l'acte, acting out, and suppression, are essential for understanding the clinical situation, where diagnosis and termination of treatment aim to conclude a temporal sequence. But to extend psychoanalysis to culture, a different set of terms is required as a kind of Rosetta Stone, true to topography but keen to delineate boundary conditions. These terms are not about Euclidean visuality, but rather about the problems that occur when projective 2D forms are immersed into 3D. They were intentionally chosen to be a bit weird, so that they would come in only with light baggage containing traceable contents. Who would deny Lacan access to the toilet, for example, where the porcelain appliance favored in the West for elimination of waste reveals its topology, but where we have to use the cartographic cut, cathesis, and isomerics to describe just what is going on when Gene Hackman is presented with an analog of what he's doing to the conversations of the couple he's assigned to spy on. Without these new terms, we could never see the connection to the Pomerium wall of ancient Rome, or understand the foundation wall's ritual relation to blood poured in a trench. I'm not being presumptuous here, but clinicians need to know how to speak a visual language to break into this cultural material. Lacan's slide rule tends to baffle those who encounter it in Seminar 14, especially those in the demographic that have no idea what a slide rule actually is. But in popular culture, where effectiveness is all important, projective topology engages with the 2D surfaces of the unary trait, metaphor, and parapraxis on a daily basis. If Lacan's example of the logic of the chase scene is obscure for some of the readers of Seminar 7, who do not care to research the backstory of the Apollo-Daphne story, it will be clearer with the visual gags of Chaplin as he folds the space of the chase to present a clear case for paralysis, with more laughs than Daphne's trick of metamorphizing into a laurel tree. My argument is for extending Lacan in the same way Lacan extends the psyche visually, but with a vocabulary fit to the conditions by which projective forms are immersed into 3-space, where the cuts and inside-out conversions that are invisible in the projective plane become the enigmas, stories, jokes, goofs, puzzles, slips of the tongue, and gaffes of perspectival experience. In painting, there is a cut to begin with, a cut that anamorphosis begins to mock in the 16th century. Architecture, which is required to imagine built spaces through projective drawings, is more technically invested in projection than the other arts, although projection is a factor in all of them, including the most temporal performative media, theater, music, and dance. Architecture must put up with frozen structures that accommodate dynamic use and reception, so even here the necessary suffering benefits psychoanalysis. Finally, I invite you to visit the small group of architects interested in Lacan, who have, during COVID times, sponsored Zoom seminars on such topics as the allethosphere, comics, and the Stendhal syndrome.